It started like a whisper in the quiet corners of a sleepy neighborhood. A routine no one noticed at first, until one man did. The morning sun spilled gently over the cracked sidewalks and rustling trees of Pine Street. The days there moved slow, peaceful, like an old clock still ticking in a forgotten room. Neighbors waved, lawns were mowed, life passed as it always had, and every morning, at exactly 7:45 a.m., a striped tabby cat would emerge from behind the bakery on the corner. Not stray, not wild. He looked too clean for that. His coat was brushed with shades of amber and charcoal, eyes bright as polished glass, and his tail swayed with calm purpose. But what struck those who watched, eventually, was what he carried. In his mouth, dangling delicately between his teeth, was always something, food. Sometimes a crust of bread, sometimes a torn plastic bag with scraps. Once, a piece of chicken so big he nearly stumbled with the weight. Never the same thing twice, always food. The cat never stopped to eat it. He didn't linger, he didn't beg. He crossed the street with graceful determination, darted between the hedges by the closed hardware store, and vanished into the alley behind the fenced lot at the edge of town. And then, nothing. No one knew where he went. At first, people just smiled. Cats do strange things, they said. Maybe he's hiding it. Maybe it's a game. But for Mr. Albert Green, a retired school teacher whose apartment overlooked the alley, it was something more. He noticed patterns others didn't, and he had the time to watch. He started keeping track. Monday, a paper napkin with rice. Tuesday, a slice of cold ham. Wednesday, a half-eaten hot dog from someone's trash. The cat always came from the same place, always went in the same direction, always alone. Albert began setting his coffee early, pulling up a chair near the window, watching from behind the lace curtain with quiet curiosity. Something about the cat stirred him. The way he carried that food, careful, almost reverent, it didn't feel like scavenging. It felt like duty. Albert had known duty. 35 years of classrooms, chalkboards, and troubled kids. He knew when someone wasn't just doing something, but doing it for someone. The thought made his chest ache gently. He never followed the cat, not at first. He just observed, notebook in hand, scribbling times and dates like a man studying a puzzle with missing pieces. Then one morning, Albert noticed something else. After the cat disappeared into the alley, it didn't come back out. Not for hours. Sometimes not at all until the next day. Where was he going? Where was he taking all that food? Albert asked around. Most neighbors hadn't noticed. That cat? Yeah, he's around, said the florist. Kinda cute. Thought he was from the bakery. The baker shrugged. Not mine. But he sits by the back door sometimes. Never begs. I leave scraps now and then. One child said he saw the cat near the abandoned garage lot. Another said he followed him once, but the cat hissed and ran off. It deepened Albert's curiosity. He began to feel it in his bones, that old fire from years of unraveling childhood secrets in school hallways. Something wasn't right. Or maybe something extraordinary was happening just under their noses, and no one saw it but him. The next morning, Albert stepped outside. For the first time in weeks, he would not just watch from the window, he would follow. But that is when things began to change. Albert Green hadn't walked much since his knees gave up on him 5 years ago. But that morning, he rose earlier than usual, stuffed a notebook into his coat pocket, and stepped into the chill air with a cane in one hand and a question in his heart. The tabby, Albert had begun calling him Milo, though he didn't know why, was already there. Perched by the bakery's back door, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws, waiting. At 7:45 sharp, the door creaked open. A bakery worker, a young woman with flour-streaked cheeks, stepped out with a small bundle wrapped in parchment paper. Without a word, she knelt and set it down. "Good morning, little guy," she whispered, as if to a priest. Milo padded forward, picked up the package delicately, and turned away. Albert followed. Not too close. He didn't want to spook him, but just far enough to keep sight of that striped tail weaving through the hedges and across the street. The cat never looked back. Past the closed hardware store, he ducked into the alley. Albert quickened his step. The air smelled of rust and old oil. Weeds cracked through the concrete. Shadows shifted between broken fences and piles of forgotten junk. Then, Milo disappeared, just like that. Albert stopped, blinking. No door, no gap, just an empty alley and the wind. He waited. Nothing. The next day, the same ritual played out. Milo received the parcel, crossed the street, entered the alley, and vanished. Albert spent the next 3 mornings in that alley, watching, listening. He spoke softly. "Where are you going, little fellow?" Silence. He left a trail of bits, chicken, cheese, even sardines. But the cat never touched them. He wasn't interested in easier meals, only in the one he carried. It puzzled Albert deeply. It wasn't hunger that drove him. It was intention. One afternoon, Albert spotted something. A glint of movement by the corner of the alley wall, almost invisible. A narrow space between the boards of a fence, hidden behind a crumbling stack of bricks. He approached, carefully. The gap was just wide enough for a cat to slip through. On the other side, a tangled lot, wild grass, rusted tools, and a collapsed garage with a sagging roof. Abandoned. As he peered through the gap, a faint sound reached him. Not a meow, a whimper. Very soft, very faint. Albert stepped back, heart tightening in his chest. The next day, he brought a flashlight. He waited until Milo passed with his morning parcel, then followed once more. But this time, he moved fast. He reached the alley just as the cat slipped through the broken fence. Albert dropped to one knee, aimed the light through the gap, and looked. There, under the shadow of the ruined garage, Milo was disappearing behind a mound of old tires. Gone again. But now Albert was sure. This was no game. The cat was delivering food. To something. Or someone. Inside that garage, he needed to know what. The wind picked up that night. The kind of wind that whistles through the cracks of old buildings and carries secrets no one's ready to hear. Albert didn't sleep. He sat in his armchair, flashlight beside him, eyes drifting again and again to the notes he had scrawled. Times, dates, the kinds of food. A crude map of the alley. He circled one word over and over. Why? He had to go back. At first light, he packed a small bag, crackers, water, a roll of gauze just in case. He didn't know what he'd find, but his gut had rarely been wrong in 80 years. Something was living in that garage, and Milo was feeding it. He waited for the cat to appear, just like always. 7:45, on the dot. This time, Milo had no food in his mouth, just a look of urgency. He glanced up at Albert, met his eyes, and for a moment the man swore he saw a flicker of recognition, as if the cat knew he was being followed. Then, Milo turned and trotted across the street. Albert followed with determination, past the bakery, past the hardware store, into the alley. Milo slipped into the hidden gap once again, but this time, Albert didn't stop. With effort, he lowered himself to the ground and slid through the narrow space. The cold wood scraped his shoulder. His knee barked with pain, but he pressed on. Inside, the world changed. The lot was like a graveyard of forgotten things. weeds waist-high, rusted tools leaning like drunk soldiers. The collapsed garage loomed like a broken mouth. The air was heavy, not foul, but old, stale, as if no one had breathed here in years. Albert moved slowly, scanning the scene. Milo's tail disappeared behind a stack of wooden boards leaning against the far wall. Then came the sound again, a faint cry, not a meow, not feline, a pup's whimper. Albert's heart caught. He hobbled forward, swept the boards aside, and froze. There, tucked beneath a makeshift shelter of torn tarp and shredded fabric, were two tiny forms. Puppies, one black, one golden, curled together like mismatched socks. Their ribs showed. Their eyes, barely open, blinked with sluggish fear. And beside them, Milo. The cat sat proudly, as if he were their mother. Albert stared, mouth dry. His mind reeled with questions. Why puppies? Why this cat? Had their mother died? Been driven off? Had he rescued them? Milo nudged the black pup gently, then turned to Albert. Not a hiss, not a growl, just a long, deep look. Something passed between them, an understanding. Albert knelt. He didn't touch them, not yet, but his hands trembled with the urge to scoop them up, to warm them. The golden pup let out a weak yelp. Milo responded with a soft trill and pressed his body closer to the pups, curling protectively. Albert whispered, "My God, you've been keeping them alive." He sat there for over an hour, watching, listening. Milo nudged one of the food scraps toward the golden pup, who sniffed it weakly. The black one didn't move much. That worried Albert. He made a decision. Tomorrow, he would come back, with help. But as he turned to leave, he felt it, a presence. Eyes watching from the trees beyond the fence. A flicker of movement in the brush. Albert turned sharply, scanning, but saw nothing. Still, the sense lingered. He wasn't alone, and neither were they. The next morning, Albert returned with a backpack slung over his shoulder, heavier than his knees would like. Inside, soft blankets, clean rags, and 2 cans of premium wet dog food. He hadn't set foot in a pet store in years. The cashier asked if he had a dog. He only replied, "Not exactly." Milo was already there, waiting at the alley's edge. But something had changed. He didn't carry food. He sat still, eyes locked on Albert, as if measuring his intent. His tail flicked once, twice. Then he turned, tail high, and disappeared into the gap. Albert followed again, slower today, knees groaning. He slipped into the overgrown lot and crossed carefully to the broken garage. The morning sun cracked through the clouds, catching on dust motes and broken glass like glitter suspended in grief. Milo sat beside the pups, licking the golden one's ear. The black pup lay motionless. Albert froze. No movement, no breath, just the stillness that tells a story before the mind is ready to accept it. "No," he whispered. He crawled forward, heart pounding, and reached out gently. The pup's tiny body was cold. Gone. Milo didn't flinch. He simply laid his head beside the lifeless body, closing his eyes. Albert felt a heaviness in his throat he hadn't known in decades. A weight that dragged up memories of holding a friend's hand in hospice, of a classroom desk left empty after winter break. The golden pup whimpered. Alive. Weak, but alive. Albert unzipped his bag and opened the can of food, setting it carefully beside the little body. The golden pup sniffed, licked once. Milo nudged it gently, encouraging. Albert whispered, "You're saving her, aren't you?" He tried to lift the golden pup, just enough to inspect her limbs. Milo growled, low and warning. Albert froze. "I'm trying to help," he murmured. "I swear to you, I'm just trying to help." Milo didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a reluctant breath, he stepped back. Albert scooped the pup gently into a towel, checking her paws, ribs, belly. She trembled, but didn't cry. He dabbed a bit of food on her tongue. She swallowed. It was something. But she wouldn't survive much longer out here. Albert knew he had to act fast. He snapped a photo with his old flip phone. It was all he had, and made his way to the local animal shelter. He showed them the image, explained what he'd found, and begged them to help. The receptionist's face softened, but her answer was blunt. "We're full. We can give you supplies, but we can't take them in right now." Frustration built in Albert's chest. "They'll die out there," he said. "I know," she whispered. He took what he could, formula, a bottle, a heating pad, and left. Over the next 2 days, Albert returned again and again, tending the golden pup, now named Lily, while Milo watched his every move. He tried to get Milo to come closer, to let himself be carried. He brought tuna, treats, even a carrier. But the cat stayed just out of reach. Every time Albert moved too fast, Milo would disappear into the weeds, re-emerging only when the air had calmed. Albert began to talk to him softly, like a friend. "You're not just protecting her," he said one afternoon as he refilled the bottle. "You're grieving too, aren't you?" Milo's ears twitched. He blinked slowly, then laid beside Lily, pulling her close with his paw. Albert felt something break open in his chest. This cat, this silent, steadfast soul, had become her guardian, her warmth, her hope. And Albert was starting to feel the same. The morning Lily didn't wake, Albert thought he'd lost her too. He had arrived early, heart already bracing for another burial under the trees. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that presses on your skin like a warning. Lily was curled beneath the tarp, her breathing shallow, her tiny chest rising only slightly with each breath. Milo was nowhere to be seen. Albert knelt beside her, panic rising in his throat. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he whispered, fumbling with the heating pad. He wrapped her up in a soft towel and pressed her against his chest. Still no Milo. "Where is he? Where did you go, boy?" Albert called softly, eyes scanning the weeds. Then, a sound, a rustling from the far end of the lot, a sharp crack of twigs. Milo emerged, not alone. Behind him, limping, covered in dried mud and burrs, was a dog, a mother, thin as wire. Her ribs jutted beneath her fur, her eyes, wild, hollow, locked onto Albert with protective fury. She didn't bark, she didn't charge, she simply stood beside Milo, trembling. Albert's breath caught in his chest. You're her mother." The dog moved forward, slowly, sniffing at Lily, then gave a soft whine that sounded like apology and grief all at once. Albert understood. She had tried to protect them, tried to survive. But it was Milo, the cat, who had stepped in when she could no longer carry the weight. The mother dog licked Lily's face. The pup stirred. Albert wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You never left them. You just couldn't get back." Milo sat between them now, like a bridge between species, between sorrow and survival. He looked up at Albert and blinked. Albert whispered, "You saved her life. You saved all of us." Later that day, he returned with a vet. Lily was rushed to the clinic. She was dehydrated, malnourished, but she would live. The mother dog, whom they named Nina, was treated for infections and slowly began to regain strength. She had likely been trapped or injured when the pups were born, leaving Milo, her unlikely ally, to take on her role. Milo refused to be separated. When they placed Lily in a recovery box, he lay curled around her. When Nina whimpered in the crate, Milo would sit outside, eyes never leaving hers. Even the vet said she'd never seen anything like it. Albert took them all home. It wasn't easy, the feeding schedules, the cleanup, the reintroduction of trust. But as the days passed, the old man's apartment filled with a kind of warmth that hadn't been there in years. Lily began to play, Nina began to smile, and Milo stayed ever watchful, ever near. Not a pet, a guardian. Word spread. At first, it was just the vet who told the story, a cat who saved a dog's pups. Then it was the assistant who posted a photo. Then someone from the shelter shared a post with 2 words beneath Milo's picture: True Guardian. Within a week, a local paper picked it up. A photo of Albert in his armchair, Lily sleeping on his lap, Milo curled by her side, Nina resting peacefully at Albert's feet. But what couldn't be captured in the photos, or even in the article, was what Albert felt when he looked at them. Peace, purpose, a kind of quiet, living grace. He had spent years in solitude after his wife passed. His children had moved away. Life had grown still, too still. And now, he woke up to paws on the floor, tails flicking in sunlight, soft barks, warm fur, love in motion. One morning, he found Milo sitting in the window, watching the trees sway. Albert sat beside him and whispered, "You knew more than any of us." Because Milo hadn't just delivered food, he had delivered hope. To Lily, who grew stronger every day, tail wagging at the slightest sound. To Nina, who slowly learned she was safe again, leaning into Albert's hand when he sat beside her. And to Albert, who now kept 2 bowls by the door, 2 leashes on the wall, and 3 hearts inside his home. Neighbors began to stop by more often, to see the animals, to ask about Milo. The children drew pictures. One note taped to Albert's mailbox read, "Thank you for believing in something bigger than fear." Albert smiled. He hadn't done it alone. He watched as Milo stretched across the rug, tail curling like a question mark. Some questions never needed answering. Because sometimes, in the quiet corners of the world, a cat carries food not because he's hungry, but because he understands what it means to keep another life going. And that changes everything. Some say animals don't feel what we feel, that they act on instinct, not empathy. But maybe it's not that they lack emotion. Maybe it's that their love is quieter, deeper, more honest. Milo never asked for anything. He never made a sound. He just did what needed to be done. And in doing so, he reminded one old man and an entire town what it means to care without reason, to love without limits, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of kindness, and in the animals who teach us more than words ever could.